there I was, standing in the frozen food aisle at Target, trying to make a very important decision, veggie or cheese pizza, when out of my peripheral, a guy entered. I knew he was gonna say something to me, you know, how you just know. And sure enough, he did. He began, "Where are you from?" I answered, "Here, Memphis." "Your parents, where are they from?" "My dad is from Wisconsin. My mom is from here." "Your grandparents, your great-grandparents, where are they from?" "My dad's family is from Germany and France. My mom's side, I'm actually not sure." "You know what I'm asking. Where are you really from?" "Well, I was born in Korea." "I knew it. Korea," he declared triumphantly, as if we were contestants on a game show and not two strangers surrounded by frozen food. He walked away self-satisfied, completely oblivious to the fact that my lineage and my identity did not exist for entertainment, that what had brought me to this aisle was a much simpler question. What's for dinner? Not who am I? This wasn't the first or second or even third time that someone had assumed they had the right to ask, assumed that I would answer, and expected that I would confirm that I was from anywhere but here. That day, it was the frozen food aisle. But it's been so many other days, so many everyday places that it stopped being noteworthy a long time ago. But the questions, they're all the same. Where are you really from? Where are your parents from? What nationality are you? Questions that always imply, who are you? You're different. You don't belong here. In social psychology, there's a theory of self-concept called the looking glass self. It's the idea that how we see ourselves is influenced by the perceptions of those around us. We come to understand or think we understand how other people see us through what Charles H. Cooley called reflected appraisals. These reflected appraisals or judgments can be positive or negative. They can be explicit comments or implicit messages conveyed through body language, facial expressions, even eye contact or the lack thereof. Reflected appraisals can come from friends, family, community members, teachers, people we look up to, and yes, even strangers on the frozen food aisle. Over time, these same judgments, repeatedly reflected back to us, can shape our self-concept, who we think we are. We can begin to see through the eyes of others and believe what we see. One of the first places where we establish a sense of who we are, where we belong, is family. Family gives us a lens to understand ourselves and the world around us, a lens to understand how the world sees us. In fact, psychologists have found that every family has a unifying family narrative, a story about who we are and what it means to belong. This is my family. Me, my mom, my dad. What do you see? I mean, besides those 1980s big frame glasses that have come back in style and out again, I don't look like my family. My family is white. I'm not. It's okay to notice race. Race is a structuring part of our world. In the US, race continues to be a defining feature of our daily lives, our life outcomes, and how the world sees us. In the US, research has found that, along with gender, race is one of the first attributes we notice or try to discern when interacting with someone for the first time. After all, in the US, in the eyes of the law, race has made it possible for us to belong or not in our immediate family and the national family. For example, anti-miscegenation laws restricted interracial marriage. And while we commonly think about this in terms of limiting white and black interracial marriages, Native Americans, Mexicans, and Asians were also prohibited from intermarrying with whites. The law would not recognize you as family. And when it comes to children and families, early adoption practices were guided by this idea of race matching. Children and families were matched by race and ethnicity, as well as other characteristics, in order to present a family that appeared as if they were biologically related. To be real family meant to share blood. Family created through adoption, therefore, had to be hidden from the outside looking in, and often hidden within the family from adoptees themselves, making adoption secretive, stigmatized, a source of shame. The law recognized you as family only if your differences were unrecognizable. Yet, in the 1950s, when race-matching policies still were adoption best practices, when Asians still were aliens ineligible for citizenship, and when immigration laws still barred anyone from the Asiatic zone from coming into the US, American couples began demanding to adopt children from Korea. As a result of the US's reframing of its failure in the Korean War into a humanitarian mission, a mission to save the Korean orphans left in the aftermath of a war-torn country and provide them with a better life. And so began the international adoption industry as we know it today. Over 150,000 Korean children would eventually immigrate into the US via adoption, primarily into white families. I was one of those Korean children. In 1983, my parents adopted me when I was 4 months old, and I would come to grow up in America. So when you're adopted from another country, how do you come to understand who you are and where you belong when some of the primary ways you're expected to find belonging cannot be relied upon? When there were active efforts to erase your family history, your immigration story, and your heritage culture. When the repeated reflected appraisals, the judgments are, where are you really from? What about your real parents? Who are you? And it wasn't just the countless strangers who wanted to guess where I was really from. It was in elementary school when a friend of mine, in the heat of the argument, said, "At least my mother loved me and didn't put me up for adoption." Or around the holidays, after playful banter back and forth with my family, an aunt who said, "You must be used to it by now. You've been around the family for over 30 years." Or the stranger who yelled out of her car at me, "Run back to China." While her directive was an impossibility, her meaning, like that of the conscious and unconscious comments from friends and family, was clear. After a lifetime of this, I was about a year into therapy when, exasperated after trying and having failed to truly convey the depth and breadth of the incessant questioning about my identity, how the repeated reflected appraisals from friends, family, people I looked up to, and yes, even strangers communicated that I was out of place, that I finally exclaimed, "I'll never belong." My therapist simply looked at me and asked, "Is it true that you'll never belong? Or is that the story you've been telling yourself?" Remember, the same reflected appraisals repeated over time can shape who we think we are. I had gotten so accustomed to the judgments that told me my belonging was limited, my identity inauthentic, my complete acceptance out of reach, that I had accepted that it was true. But it was time for that story to be over. Now, you would think I'd been telling myself a different story. I mean, after all, I already knew that there were countless people with stories similar to mine. In my research, I've talked to hundreds of Korean adoptees, adopted primarily into white families, adoptees who grew up in cities, suburbs, rural areas across the US, and almost all had similar experiences of being made to feel out of place in their families, in their communities, in this country, by friends, family, and strangers. And even among those who said, they were never made to feel any different, they had internalized the belief that people who looked like them, like me, like us, didn't look like we belonged. What most Korean adoptees had grown up believing were individual experiences, what I had grown up believing was an individual experience, were actually shared pattern judgments. But the thing about the looking glass self is that sometimes we're looking into the wrong mirror. We're looking into a mirror that someone else is holding, and we're seeing a reflection of the stories they've told themselves about who they are and what it means to belong. We've accepted as true things about ourselves that, despite the repeated judgments, were never true. So while everyone else felt they had the right to ask their questions and the right to answers that satisfied their curiosity, we too were asking our own questions. That was something else many of the Korean adoptees I've spoken to shared. Although the repeated reflected appraisals told us that we didn't belong, that story didn't quite feel right. You know how you just know. So we asked our own questions to our adoptive parents. We asked our own questions to our adoption paperwork. We asked our own questions to our adoption agencies, to the Korean government, to the US government. We asked our own questions. And some of us asked questions in a silent hope, in a quiet anguish, in a longing that could not be put into words. All questions to understand who we are, where we belong, that we weren't the only ones. And we weren't the only ones. Over the past several decades, as various cohorts of Korean adoptees have entered into adulthood, we have found one another, all because of the courage to ask our own questions and find our own answers. We kept looking, determined to find a mirror that reflected who we are. We were determined to write our own stories. In truth, I had stopped looking, not because I wasn't curious, but because repeatedly not finding any answers was painful. Because sometimes we learn to make ourselves small. Because sometimes we forget who writes our story. So while Korean adoptees have been finding one another since the 1980s through word of mouth and flyers on bulletin board with the help of media publicity, and then through online listservs and online groups and adoptee-created YouTube, blogs, podcasts, social media, I was hesitant to start. I would be well into adulthood before I allowed myself to be curious again. There I was at a Korean adoptee-only leadership workshop, something familiar enough that I could just be there for the professional development, something safe enough that I could feel as if I was meant to be there. But really, all I felt was afraid. What if the belonging I was looking for didn't exist? What if the reflected appraisals were true? What if it wasn't just a story I was telling myself? Since then, I would find myself at countless Korean adoptee-only events and conferences across the US and in Korea, and while it was belonging that I thought I had found, belonging isn't found in shared circumstances, in the search for answers to shared questions. Belonging isn't found in shared blood, in policies, in paperwork, in laws. Belonging isn't found at all. It's created. It's created in a curiosity to know and be known by one another, fueled by an unspoken hope to be accepted for exactly and all of who you are. And isn't that something we all share? Sometimes belonging begins with the courage to question the ways you've been taught that it means to be accepted, to question if you're seeing clearly. Who are you? Is it true? What story do you want to tell? Who do you need to be? And instead of trying to find the answer out there, I hope you know that it was always inside, waiting for you to create it from within. Thank you.